Hello and welcome back to the Elephant Lounge. I'm your host Tuesday. I want to thank you so much for joining me. We are in episode 4 of this series entitled Why They Are Guilty. In the previous 2 episodes, I went over an example of propaganda and I broke down some of the elements and things to watch for and how it operates. For this episode, we are going to focus in on fallacies, and we're going to talk about the very different types of fallacies there are, and then from there we're going to talk a little bit about the cult-like behavior that we so often see whenever these pieces of propaganda about murders, rapists, and pedophiles are released to the public. We see these groups online and they form these hive minds, and they behave very much like cults. We're going to touch upon that just a little bit so that we know to look out for that behavior and try and avoid it for ourselves. So let's talk about fallacies. First of all, there are hundreds of fallacies, and as you get deeper into certain areas of study like philosophy, you'll discover even more fallacies. It seems like a never-ending list of fallacies. But ultimately, I want to go over some main core types of fallacies. And the reason for doing this, and this might be a review for some of you, I realize that, but by learning to understand fallacies, what they are, we train our brain to be more discerning about the information that we are absorbing. We're raising the standard, if you will, to not wallow around in sophomore talking points or circular logic. We're not going to be deceived by those type of cheap tricks that propaganda likes to use on us. No, we are going to raise our awareness and raise our standard. And we do that by learning how to identify these poor arguments. And that's what fallacies are. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're false. It means that they are poor arguments. And we have to reach higher and climb longer up to the top to get the best arguments that we can get. And that will then help us learn to develop a better idea of what's going on, to form a more objective and truthful opinion about things. That is the goal. And also by learning about fallacies, we can avoid making fallacies ourselves. Or we recognize when we make a fallacious argument, and then we learn to back up that argument with facts, make that a strong argument. So the first fallacy is the straw man fallacy. Very common tactic. It is when someone is misrepresenting their opponent's argument. They proceed to tear down that argument and ultimately never address what's actually going on. They just declare themselves the winner because they knocked down an argument no one was making in the first place. So this is very common, and we actually see this a lot in politics. But one way to avoid straw manning your opponent is to do the exact opposite, and that's what we call steel manning, where you really look deep to understand what it is your opponent is trying to say. What is their argument? Get down to the core. Find their strongest argument that they have, and then proceed to tear down that argument. That is what we call steel manning. And I talked a little bit about this in the previous episode, where you do things like you give your opponent the benefit of the doubt, or you assume what they're telling you is true, and you ask yourself, does it matter? Is this something that affects the whole? Is it actually addressing the argument that you're making? That's what we call steel manning. You're trying to give the benefit of the doubt. You're trying to really understand what it is your opponent is saying, and then you proceed to work from there. We can also talk about another fallacy that I spoke about quite frequently, which was the false dichotomy or black and white. Now, this is one that I have cautioned. There are black and white issues. There are times when it is either or. It's either day or it's night. It's not both. But whenever somebody presents this type of argument to you, you need to consider, wait a minute, can those two things be true at the same time? Is it possible for those two things to be true at the same time? When it's a fallacious argument, it means yes, those two things can be true at the same time. So we always want to make sure that we check that and we think very carefully about that possibility if ever we're presented with a black and white type of argument. We also have special pleading, and this essentially is when somebody's making an argument and they're applying high standards to other people, okay? They're applying very high standards to other people, but very low standards to themselves, or they're making some type of an argument that it's good for you, it's not good for me, okay? And this is another very common one when we're talking about propaganda as it pertains to crime. When we're talking about Stephen Avery, for instance, we're talking about making a murder, just as an example, you will see that there were two trials, one for Brandon and one for Stephen. Both were proven guilty in a court of law. Both of them. Two separate trials. And yet what will happen is the supporters will come in and they dismiss all of the evidence against those two. They just dismiss it, they excuse it, whatever they got to do. But at the same time, coincidentally enough, they have no problem going after a neighbor, an ex-boyfriend, a friend, anybody, the police. Anybody and everybody has been blamed for the murder of Teresa Halbach. Anybody but Stephen and Brendan. So it's sort of this special pleading. It's a special case where you're asking people to apply these different standards to other people that you wouldn't apply to Stephen and Brendan, for example. And I always found that fascinating because it really gets to a point with them that they're so convinced, it's just their belief. So there's no level, right? There's no way you can prove that they ever did it because they just didn't do it. It's just their belief. But they have no problem accusing anybody else where there is no evidence. And this leads us to another fallacy, which is that refers to the burden of proof, where when you're dealing with some certain people like that, they don't seem to understand that the burden of proof has now switched to them, especially in the case of Stephen and Brendan, because it's already been proven beyond a reasonable doubt that they are guilty. So now the burden of proof has been shifted over to the defense. They have to prove who did the murder. Who was it? Where's the evidence? What happened? You have to be able to do that. And as we go further along in this series, I promise you I will be talking about a case where a man was wrongly convicted. And guess what? He has an opposing narrative. Like, they can finally tell you what actually happened. It wasn't just, I didn't do it. They actually ended up figuring out who the killer was in this case. They actually figured out who ended up doing it. That's what happens when you actually have a narrative that explains exactly what happened. Okay, so some other fallacies. Obviously, ad hominem. This is when they attack the messenger. Poor Dan Reed. He's been attacked so many times. He has absolutely nothing to do with Michael Jackson. He told the story of Michael Jackson's victims, and yet the attacks upon him prove absolutely nothing, but they'll do it anyway. And then this can lead us into another fallacy, which is the red herring. It's inevitable when you're talking about Michael Jackson. The people will start talking about Oprah Winfrey, and all over you'll see these comments about how Oprah didn't go after Harvey Weinstein. Well, who cares if he didn't go after Harvey Weinstein? What does that have to do with Michael Jackson sleeping in bed with little boys and being a pedophile? Absolutely nothing. Nothing! It's just a red herring. It's an attempt to throw in a topic or an issue that has absolutely nothing to do with what you're talking about because they don't want to address the actual facts and evidence and information that you're presenting. They don't want to address it, so they throw in something else and attempt to form some type of logical conclusion, and you just can't do it that way. Loaded questions. We see this a lot. This is a question that presupposes an unverified assumption that the person being questioned is likely to disagree with, putting the person being questioned on defense. This is the "when did you stop beating your wife" question. This will happen a lot. Whenever you're presented with something like this, you need to immediately point out to the person that you're asking me something with a premise to which I do not agree. This is a loaded question. We also have begging the question. This is also about circular reasoning. This is making a claim, okay, and you have to accept that claim, and then you make this other claim and you have to accept it to be true because you made the premise. Okay, it's basically saying, I'm right because I said I'm right, and this is right. A perfect example of this is Michael Jackson loved children. He would never hurt a child. He said so. I have to agree that Michael Jackson loved children. I do not agree with that premise. Therefore, he would never hurt a child means absolutely nothing to me. But they're trying to somehow draw a conclusion between that. He would never hurt a child. Well, him and all the other pedophiles out there, they don't believe they're hurting children. Why do you think it takes 20 years for these victims to realize that they're victims? Because they don't realize that they're being hurt. They don't realize that. They don't understand what's going on. They're not old enough to consent to that type of a relationship. This is why we have laws protecting children. This is why it's so hard and awful. And that will bring me to another fallacy, which is arguing from personal incredulity. And this is when you're arguing with somebody who just doesn't know what the hell they're talking about. So if you're talking to someone who doesn't know anything about child sexual abuse, but yet they're making these arguments, it can be very frustrating for the person having to listen to this because you know that the person you're arguing with doesn't know what the hell they're talking about. And in order to avoid arguing from personal incredulity, just try not to argue about stuff you really don't know about. I mean, it's pretty easy, which fortunately will put you in very few arguments because the truth is most of us only know a few things. If you really want to get down to it, most of us only really know a few things. Compared to the vast, enormous amount of topics that are out there, oh yeah, we own a small percentage. And the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know as much because there's so many different topics out there. So it's very easy for us to fall into that, but it's also very easy for us to avoid it. We also have appealing to emotion. This is every argument. Every argument wants to appeal to your emotion. Every film you see, every piece of art you look at, every song you listen to, it's all about appealing to your emotion. And politics and true crime and all of these things. Everybody's always trying to appeal to your emotion or your ego. This is the easiest way to argue. And as I said in the very beginning, listen, we want to raise our standard. We want to listen to information that they're making a good argument. And while appealing to someone's emotion and ego can be a natural thing to do, is it really the best argument? No, it's not. In fact, in many cases, it's a horrible type of argumentation. That's why it's fallacious. But then that leads us into the fallacy, which is just because it's a fallacious argument doesn't mean it's a wrong argument. So you can have people appealing to your emotion, and they're right. They are telling you a correct argument. However, it's always something you need to keep in mind. You need to be cognizant of when your emotions are being appealed to or when your ego is being appealed to. Cherry picking. Cherry picking is everywhere. This is when people come along and they pick up little facts and they isolate them, and they pretend everything occurs in a vacuum. And of course, this always happens all the time. So when someone's trying to pull out little facts, always consider what are the circumstances of those facts. You want to know the whole story. You don't want to just pick out little numbers or statistics or pick out little things, or Michael Jackson had girls stay with him too. Really? Did he? What are the facts behind that? Michael Jackson got married twice. Okay. Do you want to mention the fact that nobody believed it was real? Do you want to mention the fact that no staff member said that they were together or slept together in the same room? Do you want to mention that fact? So be careful with the cherry picking, another very common tactic. And then, of course, we have the anecdotal fallacy. This is where someone always comes along with their anecdotal story because their aunt or their cousin, sister's brother's friend from New Haven, Connecticut once did something, and therefore it's for everyone. Okay. There's always somebody who wants to come in with an anecdote about what happened to them or what happened to someone they know. Anecdotes are very powerful and persuasive in argumentation. However, keep in mind when you're being told an anecdote, maybe it has some leverage, maybe there's something to it, but maybe not. Is it an anomaly? Is it something that should be considered isolated and just anecdotal? A lot of times you shouldn't put too much weight into some type of anecdotal story because more than likely it is anomalous, meaning it's not the norm. And if it's not the norm, it's not something that you can apply to the whole. Which brings us to the composition division fallacy, which is if something applies to the part, it must apply to the whole, or vice versa. If something is true for the whole, it's true for the part. That is not true. That's why the anecdotal fallacy it's very similar. It's very connected because you're trying to take some story that applied to a part and then apply it to perhaps everyone. Like your experience or someone you know, their experience somehow should apply to everybody else. So that's kind of a 2-for-1 as it goes for fallacies there. The other, I don't know, did I mention already? Bandwagon fallacy. This is the ad populum fallacy, or maybe appeal to authority. This is another very popular argument that can be made. And I've made that argument many times where I talk about Michael Jackson in the case of Michael Jackson, when he was investigated, none of the investigators and none of the specialists, the psychiatrists, none of them believed he was innocent. Now, if that was my only argument, then that would be a fallacious argument, okay? But I also back that up with facts and all this other stuff and all the other information that we have about Michael Jackson, and therefore it makes that argument stronger. So some of these arguments can indeed be correct, as I said, but just make sure that when you're making them, or you hear somebody making them, look a little bit deeper. Are they telling you more? Or are they just hinging their entire argument on that one point? Now, as you'll notice, as we went through these, you've probably noticed that a lot of these kind of run in together. And you can see that sometimes one fallacy can also be considered another type of fallacy. You can create an anecdotal argument, for instance, that's actually a straw man. You can have these things sort of run in together. Any type of appeal to emotion, for instance, can also be an argument of personal incredulity. Anything like that. So just keep that stuff in mind. There are many websites that talk about fallacies and get to know them. Become familiar with them. Always just when you see people making one fallacious argument after the next, know that you're dealing with propaganda. And then the next question you have to ask is, what are they telling you? What are they not telling you? Did they make a claim? Did they prove their claim? Where can I find information to prove that claim? And then you do your research from there. Now, interestingly enough, whenever we see these propaganda pieces pop up online or pop up on Netflix or wherever we're watching, we automatically see people rush to online social media sites like Facebook and Twitter and Reddit and all these other places, and these groups begin to form. There's different behaviors that go on in these different groups, and so you want to be careful which group are you in. So are you in the group that displays excessively zealous, unquestioning commitment to a leader? You know, are you in a group that is just so devoted to Michael Jackson that you can't see straight and it's unquestionable? You're not allowed to question, doubt, or express dissent or be discouraged because you might be punished, you might be kicked out of the group. Look for that stuff. Another characteristic of a cult would be mind-altering practices such as meditation, chanting, speaking in tongues, that kind of stuff. I don't know of any of that happening within these groups. However, without a doubt, there are chantings and there are repeated elements of arguments that are made, and a lot of them are just flat out lies. So it's interesting that you see this. They will keep repeating the same things over and over and over and over again, as if they repeat it, somehow it's going to be true. But it's just not true. And I see this with Michael Jackson all the time. You know, Wade and James are liars. They're liars. They're liars. They're liars. They can't show that they're liars. I don't even think they know what a lie is. You know, a lie is saying something you know to be untrue. They've not proven that Wade or James has said anything that they know to be untrue. The best they've been able to perhaps come up with, if I give them the benefit of the doubt, is a couple inconsistencies. But that's not the same as a lie. You have to show that a person has lied. They go on and on and on and on. You know, it's the same thing that I mentioned before with the documentary. It's one-sided, it's one-sided, it's one-sided. You know, and that goes back to a fallacy of, you know, this idea that everything has to be equal or every opinion needs to be weighed equally. It's just ridiculous. I've never seen anybody complain about a World War II documentary like, why didn't we include the Nazis' position? Or, you know, why don't we say nice things about Japan? Nobody says that. Nobody says that. Nobody makes a documentary about Ted Bundy and says, well, why don't we show his side of the murders? He needs to have a voice. And that is just the dumbest argument ever. This is literally the dumbest argument ever. A lot of these people just don't seem to understand that you're fighting an uphill battle. It's not gonna happen. Your opinion is not equivalent because it's not true. That's the problem. Okay, and then in cults, we see the leadership dictates sometimes in great detail how people should think and feel, and then permission to date and change jobs or marry. I haven't seen that in any of these types of groups, of course, but I have seen instructions given to people on what everyone should think and feel and what arguments to make. I have seen that. The group is elitist, claiming special exalted status for itself, its leader, and its members. Sometimes the leader is considered the Messiah. I mean, without a doubt, we see that with Michael Jackson. Amanda Knox, I mean, that group of people really do seem to worship Amanda. I mean, she can do no wrong. You are not allowed to question Queen Amanda. And, I mean, I don't necessarily believe that they worship her or consider her a Messiah by any means. But there is a similar attempt to exalt her and make her out to be somebody that she's just not. The group is, as I said, it's elitist. So yes, That seems to happen a lot with these types of groups, where they really just sort of love and have this crazy admiration and drive for these various people. I mentioned Stephen Avery and Brandon Daisy. Anytime you go into those groups or you look at the stuff that they're posting and the fan art and all this, just worshiping almost, this genuflecting over and over, it's very bizarre. Why would you ever do that? The group has a polarized us versus them mentality, which may cause conflict in the wider society. And obviously we see this all the time. It's always the media, the media is bad. Yeah, the media is bad. I mean, don't get me wrong, there is an argument to be made there, but a lot of times it just goes way too far. It's way overblown to the point of almost absurdity. And they really, you'll see these with all these murder groupies. You'll see a lot of that, where they feel as though they're special. They have more information than the rest of everyone. Nobody else understands. The leader's not accountable to any authorities, obviously, because they can do no wrong. There's no standard by which their fans and their cult members would ever see that they've done anything wrong. It doesn't matter how much evidence, it doesn't matter what you present to them, it's just ignored or dismissed. The group teaches or implies that its supposedly exalted ends justify whatever means it deems necessary. This may result in members participating in behaviors or activities they would have considered reprehensible or unethical before joining the group. Lying to family and friends. I can't think of any examples of that, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me. During the Stephen Avery case, well, no, I don't want to use that as an example, because the problem with some of these groups, these people that rally around these murderers and stuff, the problem is these types of groups also attract a lot of mentally ill people, like legitimately mentally ill people. I don't know that they're doing anything they wouldn't normally do. This just gives them, having a cause or whatever, just gives them an excuse to act out in a way that they probably would anyway. So I don't know that would be something you could say applies to all the time. That would be an anomaly of sorts. The leadership induces feelings of shame and or guilt in order to influence or control members. I don't know. I've never been in one of those groups. If you have, let me know. Let me know how they treated you. Subservience to the leader or group requires members to cut ties with their family and friends. Now, I don't know of anyone ever talking about something as extreme as that. I think that's a real extreme cult-like behavior, and we certainly see that with Scientology. But I hope nobody that supports Michael Jackson, for instance, I don't even think they go that far that they would cut their families off. The group is preoccupied with bringing in new members and making money. And oh my gosh, yes. Especially as it pertains to money. You'll notice all of them are always raising money for something. So anytime you go into a Stephen Avery group, that family is always got some woe is me. They need tires. They need a new washer and dryer. They need this. They need that. Oh, woe is me. It's always a fundraiser. We need a nice Christmas. Our PayPal is here. Please send us money. Amanda Knox just got married, and she's e-begging for a big celebration. She wants a big celebration, so she's asking people for money. And she did that before for something else. I can't even remember. I mean, she made millions on her book. She still hasn't paid Lumumba for trash in his name. But yet, and she got money. She got money from the European Union, I think it was. If I remember correctly, she was awarded something from the government there. I think it was actually the Italian government or whatever. But anyway, she got money. And now she's online begging for money for her wedding celebration. And Damien Eccles, he's always begging for money. And that Jason from the West Memphis 3, he got $30,000 he raised for a book. Did he write it? No. Oh, they're always begging for money. All of those people. Michael Jackson, they're all begging for money. Please give me money. Members are expected to devote inordinate amounts of time to the group or group-related activities. Maybe, maybe not. I don't think that that's necessarily a requirement. Members are encouraged to or required to live and or socialize with only group members. Yes, in the sense of being online. Like, if you are in a support group, they do not want anybody to dissent. Like, you are not allowed to come in as a guiltier, as it were. That's what they call us. We're guiltiers. You're not allowed to come into the group because you're a suppressive, as it were. You are not allowed to ask them questions. You just get blocked. And for those of us on the other side, us guiltiers, we don't really care if somebody else comes in or whatever. The problem is that for some of us, we've had to lock down a lot of stuff because some of these people are they're a little nuts, okay? They're a little nuts. I've got messages left and right from Michael Jackson fans. Left and right from them, especially on Facebook. And they'll go into your request mailbox. They can't go into your direct mailbox. They have to go through some other request, I think is what it's called. And they will just send you the craziest things. And it's like, why are you sending me a private message? I had the same thing with Stephen Avery people, supporters. That's what they do. They'll send you a private message. They send you the nastiest things ever. Okay, so the most loyal members of the True Believers essentially believe there's no life outside the context of the group. I mean, I don't know. It's just an online group. I doubt it goes that far. But as you can see, we go through this list of characteristics as it pertains to cults, and there's some similarities. There are some concerns. And my biggest concern is it gets to a point where you realize these people are not reasonable people. It doesn't matter what you present them with or what information you present them with. They have a belief. Their belief is, this person is innocent. And they dismiss everything that, normally a reasonable person would look at the evidence and see, oh my God, how obvious can you get? But through the use of propaganda, they have allowed themselves to be manipulated to that end point, which is this person is innocent. And nothing will ever penetrate that. And they will dismiss everything to such an unreasonable extent that that's where this cult-like mentality begins to flourish and form. It doesn't have to be like a full-on cult. It's just this, either it's celebrity worship or it's some type of worshiping of somebody. It's very interesting. And, some of these people, you're never going to get through to them because something else is going on. That's just the way it is. Some of them they know that they're worshiping a murderer. They understand that. There's a thrill in it. I forget what it's called hybristophilia. So it's when you fall in love with people who murder. And there are legitimately people who have this. I mean, I don't know what happens, but they legitimately have this mental disorder of some sorts. And there's not much you can do about that. Then there are a lot of people who are very much attracted to like conspiracy type things. If there's a conspiracy attached to something, you will automatically draw a certain amount of schizophrenics out there. And there's not very many schizophrenics, but you will notice them. You will notice them immediately. They are very incoherent. They will write for pages and pages and pages and pages. huge. They go on and on and on forever. And of course, they bring in all this anecdotal evidence. They connect everything. Everything is connected. The whole world is connected to this one case. When I was following JonBenet Ramsey, there's a couple people on there that are very just hardcore JonBenet Ramsey case followers, right? They're all over this case. They are so convinced they know who the real killer is, and you can go through their screeds of just nonsense. Just one sentence after the next. Pages and pages and pages. And I tried to, give it a chance because I just find it so fascinating how they put all this stuff together, but it's just nonsense. And then I found out, obviously it did not surprise me when this one person in particular admitted that they were no longer taking their medicine. So that is very sad. And for those people, I have to have compassion for because it's not their fault. It is their fault if they're not taking their meds, but it's not their fault that they're born with something like that. Obviously, it's very difficult when you have something like schizophrenia because you do have all this paranoia and you don't want to take the meds because of the paranoia. But if you don't take your meds, you end up going down some pretty dangerous rabbit holes. So always watch for that and try to, I don't know how to handle those people online. You have to be very careful. It's best to just avoid them and not interact with them because you don't want to be some type of catalyst that's going to set them off, or, you have no way of interacting with them in real life. So just recognize those people and stay away from them. But hopefully this episode will have helped you sort of navigate our way through various fallacies, how to look at these fallacies, and what the dangers of falling into these arguments are. And that is this cult-like behavior. You don't want to get stuck in something like that. If you find yourself in some type of hive mind where you're not allowed to question anything and you're not allowed to look at things objectively, and everything are these bizarre arguments and inferences that literally are not attached to any type of fact, then you need to reevaluate what it is that you believe. You need to step back and reevaluate that. And hopefully, most people, I'm assuming this will just be a review, but perhaps maybe there's one or two of you that will be able to step back and think and say, well, maybe I'm not being reasonable. Okay, so in the next episode, I want to address a couple things. I don't know if I'm going to be able to address it all in one episode, but I want to touch upon the CSI effect, scientific method, following the evidence versus leading the evidence, and lazy thinking, which is basically what we covered here today, but obviously it'll keep coming up. Again, all of this is going to be cumulative, so make sure that you listen and watch the first episode and go through, because we're just going to keep building upon everything. I just really want to hammer home the point of how to think, learning how to think and not what to think, what someone is telling you. We want to approach things in a way that allows us to think for ourselves, and we're doing so in a way that is clear and concise and is productive. And by avoiding these fallacies and by demanding information that is actual argumentation, solid argumentation, and by steel-manning our opponent, we can get to the truth in a much more efficient and logical manner. And I will be back.